There's a pattern that repeats throughout history with mathematical precision. Not similar patterns, not approximate sequences, but an exact 5-phase model that has destroyed every major empire in recorded history. Rome took 2 centuries to move through all 5 phases. Byzantium stretched the pattern across 4 centuries. Britain compressed it into just 100 years. And right now, in 2025, the United States has entered phase 4. Not speculation, not theory, pattern recognition based on historical precedent. This is the story of how empires rise, peak, and inevitably decline through their own systematic decisions. How it happened to Rome, Byzantium, and Britain, and why every indicator suggests America is following the exact same trajectory. The stakes here aren't political. This isn't about left or right, conservative or progressive. This is about economic patterns that operate independently of ideology. If we're truly in phase 4, then understanding what phase 5 looks like becomes the most important question facing anyone living in or dependent on the American economy. Because historically, phase 5 has meant the end of empire status, the collapse of currency dominance, and fundamental restructuring of society. The Roman Empire fragmented, Byzantium fell to conquest, Britain lost its global position within a generation. The pattern doesn't care about military strength or technological advancement. It operates on economic fundamentals that remain constant across centuries. Before we examine each empire, let's establish the 5-phase framework. Phase 1 is expansion and innovation, where the empire grows through military conquest, technological advancement, and establishes a trusted currency. Phase 2 is peak prosperity and overconfidence, where the empire reaches maximum territorial extent, economic output peaks, and the population believes their dominance is permanent. Phase 3 is currency debasement and debt accumulation, where spending exceeds revenue, the government begins inflating the money supply, and debt grows exponentially. Phase 4 is social fragmentation and military overextension, where wealth inequality creates internal division. The military is stretched across too many commitments, and infrastructure begins deteriorating. Phase 5 is collapse and transition, where the currency loses credibility, the empire fragments or contracts, and power transfers to a new dominant nation or system. Every empire that has fallen followed these phases in sequence. No exceptions, no variations. The pattern is absolute. Let's start with Rome, because Rome established the template that every empire since has followed. Phase 1 for Rome lasted from roughly 200 BC to 1 AD. This was the period of the Roman Republic transforming into empire. Roman legions conquered Carthage, Greece, Egypt, and Gaul. Engineering innovations gave Rome aqueducts, concrete, paved roads spanning thousands of miles, and architectural techniques that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. The denarius, introduced in 201 BC, contained approximately 4.5 grams of pure silver. This wasn't just currency, it was a promise. When a merchant in Britain accepted a denarius, they knew exactly what they were getting. The silver content was standardized, the weight consistent, the purity verified. This created something more valuable than the metal itself: trust. Roman soldiers were paid in denarii. Taxes were collected in denarii. Trade across 3 continents was conducted in denarii. The currency became the foundation of the entire economic system. Phase 2 arrived with the Pax Romana, roughly 1 AD to 180 AD. Rome controlled 60 million people across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The Mediterranean was essentially a Roman lake called Mare Nostrum, our sea. No external power could challenge Roman military dominance. The economy flourished. Infrastructure connected every province. Roman citizenship expanded, bringing more people into the system. Arts, literature, philosophy all reached heights that defined Western civilization for the next 2 millennia. And crucially, the population believed this would last forever. The denarius remained strong. Trade flourished. Citizens couldn't imagine a world where Rome wasn't supreme. This confidence, this certainty of permanence, is the defining characteristic of Phase 2. Every empire experiences it, and every empire is wrong. Phase 3 began around 180 AD and accelerated through the 3rd century. The problem was simple mathematics. Rome's borders required constant defense. Legions stationed in Britain, Germania, Parthia, North Africa. Each legion needed pay, equipment, food, support infrastructure. The cost of maintaining the empire exceeded the revenue it generated. The solution seemed obvious: debase the currency. Emperor Nero, ruling from 54 to 68 AD, was the first to significantly reduce the silver content of the denarius, dropping it from 100% to 95%, then to 90%. That extra 10% was pure profit for the treasury. The same amount of silver now minted more coins. More coins in circulation meant more apparent wealth, but it wasn't real wealth, it was inflation. The pattern accelerated. By the time Emperor Caracalla ruled in 211 AD, the denarius was down to 50% silver, half real value, half base metal. By 265 AD under Emperor Gallienus, it had fallen to just 5% silver. A coin that was once pure silver was now 95% worthless metal with a thin silver coating. Think about what this meant for an average Roman. A soldier in 265 AD receiving his pay in denarii was being paid in coins worth 1/20th of what soldiers earned 2 centuries earlier. The government insisted nothing had changed. The coins still said denarius. They still bore the emperor's face. But the purchasing power had collapsed. Prices exploded accordingly. What cost 1 denarius in 200 AD cost 50 denarii by 300 AD. Farmers stopped accepting currency and demanded barter instead. Grain for tools, livestock for labor, anything but the worthless coins. Soldiers refused to fight unless paid in gold or actual goods. Tax collectors couldn't collect taxes because the currency was worthless. The entire economic system, built on trust in the denarius, simply seized up. Phase 4 arrived in the 3rd and 4th centuries with devastating clarity. The crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 AD, saw 50 different emperors in 50 years, most assassinated or killed in civil war. The empire fractured temporarily into 3 separate entities. Military generals fought each other for power, while barbarian tribes pushed against weakened borders. Wealth inequality reached extremes. The senatorial class owned vast estates worked by slaves and desperate peasants, while the urban poor depended on grain doles. The middle class of small farmers and artisans, the backbone of the early republic, had virtually disappeared. Infrastructure began failing. Roads went unrepaired. Aqueducts crumbled. The government couldn't afford maintenance. The military was simultaneously overstretched and underpaid, defending 4,000 miles of frontier with devalued currency. Germanic tribes, Persians, and other groups didn't defeat Rome through superior military force. They simply pushed against an empire that could no longer fund its own defense. Phase 5 came gradually, then suddenly. The Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 AD, when the Germanic chief Odoacer deposed the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. But the real collapse happened decades earlier when the economic system failed. By the 5th century, Roman legions were mostly Germanic mercenaries paid in whatever the empire could scrape together. Provincial governors operated independently because central authority had evaporated. Cities shrank. Literacy declined. Long-distance trade disappeared. The denarius, once trusted from Britain to Egypt, became a historical curiosity. What followed was the fragmentation of Europe into feudal kingdoms. The period called the Dark Ages, not because of ignorance, but because centralized civilization had collapsed. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, survived and actually learned temporary lessons from Rome's collapse. But the Western Empire was gone, destroyed not by foreign conquest, but by its own currency debasement and the economic collapse that followed. Byzantium offers a fascinating variation on the pattern because it lasted much longer than Rome, yet still followed the exact same 5 phases. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the Eastern Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, continued for another 1,000 years. This longevity sometimes obscures the pattern, but it's there, playing out in slow motion. Phase 1 for Byzantium actually began with Constantine's founding of Constantinople in 330 AD. The Byzantine Empire inherited Rome's infrastructure, legal system, and administrative genius, but added Greek culture and strategic positioning. Constantinople controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia. between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. This geographic advantage generated enormous wealth. The Byzantine military innovated constantly, developing Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that gave them naval superiority for centuries. The solidus, a gold coin introduced by Constantine, became the most trusted currency in the medieval world. Unlike the silver denarius that Rome debased, the solidus maintained its purity and weight for over 7 centuries. This created the foundation for Byzantine economic power. Phase 2 lasted from roughly 527 to 1025 AD, an extraordinarily long period of strength. Under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, Byzantine armies temporarily reconquered North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, nearly restoring the old Roman Empire. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537 AD, demonstrated engineering capabilities that wouldn't be surpassed until the Renaissance. Byzantine trade networks extended from Britain to China. The solidus was accepted everywhere, the medieval equivalent of the dollar today. The empire survived the initial Islamic conquests in the 7th century, held off the Persians, and maintained control of Anatolia and the Balkans. Byzantine culture preserved classical knowledge through manuscript copying and scholarship, while Western Europe struggled through the early medieval period. Most importantly, the population believed the empire was eternal. Constantinople was the richest city on earth, protected by massive walls that had never been breached. Phase 2 overconfidence was complete. Phase 3 began around 1025 AD and accelerated through the 12th century. The warning signs were familiar. Military expenses increased as the empire faced threats from all directions. Muslim powers to the east and south, Normans in Italy, Slavic kingdoms in the Balkans, and eventually the Crusaders. The Byzantine military had traditionally relied on theme system soldiers, citizens who farmed land in exchange for military service. But maintaining professional armies across multiple fronts required more funding than the theme system provided. The government turned to hiring mercenaries, which was far more expensive. Revenue began falling short of expenses. The response was predictable: debase the currency. The gold solidus, which had maintained 24-karat purity since Constantine, began declining in quality. By the 11th century, it dropped to 21 carats, then 18 carats. Each reduction was subtle, gradual, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Trade partners noticed. Merchants began testing coins, demanding payment in older, purer solidi. Italian city-states, particularly Venice, started minting their own gold coins that were more trusted than Byzantine currency. The empire that had defined monetary stability for 7 centuries was losing credibility. When Byzantine Emperor Alexios the Faun came to power in 1081, he found the treasury nearly empty and the currency in chaos. He attempted a major reform, creating a new gold coin called the hyperpyron. Initially successful, but the underlying problem remained. The empire was spending more than it earned, and no currency reform could fix fiscal mismanagement. The debasement pattern continued under different coin names. By the 13th century, Byzantine currency had lost international trust entirely. Venetian ducats and Florentine florins had replaced Byzantine coins in Mediterranean trade. Phase 4 manifested dramatically in the 12th through 14th centuries. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 provides the most shocking example of Phase 4 consequences. A Crusader army, supposedly heading to fight Muslims in Egypt, was manipulated by Venetian merchants and Byzantine political factions. They attacked and sacked Constantinople itself, the greatest Christian city in the world. For 3 days, Crusaders looted churches, palaces, and homes. Priceless manuscripts were destroyed. Ancient artworks were melted down for metal. The city that had stood unconquered for 9 centuries fell not to Muslims, but to fellow Christians, motivated partly by debt and economic desperation. The empire fragmented. Latin Crusaders established their own empire in Constantinople. Byzantine remnants survived in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. The social fragmentation was complete. Even after Byzantines recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the empire never recovered. Territory had shrunk to a fraction of its former extent. The military was overstretched, trying to defend what remained. Civil wars between rival claimants consumed resources. Wealth inequality had reached extremes, with a few aristocratic families controlling vast estates while the urban population struggled. Infrastructure decay was visible everywhere. The massive walls of Constantinople, which had protected the city for centuries, needed repairs the government couldn't afford. The navy, once dominant in the Mediterranean, had been essentially handed over to Genoan and Venetian merchants in exchange for loans. The empire was militarily overextended, socially fragmented, and financially bankrupt. Phase 5 came in 1453 when Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II besieged Constantinople with a massive army and new cannon technology that could breach the ancient walls. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine V died fighting in the final battle. The city fell on May 29, 1453, ending the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire. But the real ending had come decades earlier, when the economic system collapsed. By 1453, Constantinople's population had shrunk from over 400,000 at its peak to fewer than 50,000. The empire controlled only the city itself and a few surrounding territories. The currency was worthless. The military consisted of a few thousand defenders against an Ottoman army of over 80,000. The Ottomans didn't conquer a thriving empire. They occupied an economic corpse that had been dead for decades. Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, bringing Greek manuscripts that helped spark the Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire became the new dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The pattern had completed once again. Currency debasement, economic collapse, social fragmentation, military defeat, transition to new empire. Byzantium offers a fascinating variation on the pattern because it lasted much longer than Rome, yet still followed the exact same 5 phases. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the Eastern Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, continued for another 1,000 years. This longevity sometimes obscures the pattern, but it's there, playing out in slow motion. Phase 1 for Byzantium actually began with Constantine's founding of Constantinople in 330 AD. The Byzantine Empire inherited Rome's infrastructure, legal system, and administrative genius, but added Greek culture and strategic positioning. Constantinople controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. This geographic advantage generated enormous wealth. The Byzantine military innovated constantly, developing Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that gave them naval superiority for centuries. The solidus, a gold coin introduced by Constantine, became the most trusted currency in the medieval world. Unlike the silver denarius that Rome debased, the solidus maintained its purity and weight for over 7 centuries. This created the foundation for Byzantine economic power. Phase 2 lasted from roughly 527 to 1025 AD, an extraordinarily long period of strength. Under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, Byzantine armies temporarily reconquered North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, nearly restoring the old Roman Empire. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537 AD, demonstrated engineering capabilities that wouldn't be surpassed until the Renaissance. Byzantine trade networks extended from Britain to China. The solidus was accepted everywhere, the medieval equivalent of the dollar today. The empire survived the initial Islamic conquests in the 7th century, held off the Persians, and maintained control of Anatolia and the Balkans. Byzantine culture preserved classical knowledge through manuscript copying and scholarship, while Western Europe struggled through the early medieval period. Most importantly, the population believed the empire was eternal. Constantinople was the richest city on earth, protected by massive walls that had never been breached. Phase 2 overconfidence was complete. Phase 3 began around 1025 AD and accelerated through the 12th century. The warning signs were familiar. Military expenses increased as the empire faced threats from all directions. Muslim powers to the east and south, Normans in Italy, Slavic kingdoms in the Balkans, and eventually the Crusaders. The Byzantine military had traditionally relied on theme system soldiers, citizens who farmed land in exchange for military service. But maintaining professional armies across multiple fronts required more funding than the theme system provided. The government turned to hiring mercenaries, which was far more expensive. Revenue began falling short of expenses. The response was predictable: debased the currency. The gold solidus, which had maintained 24-karat purity since Constantine, began declining in quality. By the 11th century, it dropped to 21 carats, then 18 carats. Each reduction was subtle, gradual, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Trade partners noticed. Merchants began testing coins, demanding payment in older, purer solidi. Italian city-states, particularly Venice, started minting their own gold coins that were more trusted than Byzantine currency. The empire that had defined monetary stability for 7 centuries was losing credibility. When Byzantine Emperor Alexios the Faun came to power in 1081, he found the treasury nearly empty and the currency in chaos. He attempted a major reform, creating a new gold coin called the hyperpyron. Initially successful, but the underlying problem remained. The empire was spending more than it earned, and no currency reform could fix fiscal mismanagement. The debasement pattern continued under different coin names. By the 13th century, Byzantine currency had lost international trust entirely. Venetian ducats and Florentine florins had replaced Byzantine coins in Mediterranean trade. Phase 4 manifested dramatically in the 12th through 14th centuries. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 provides the most shocking example of Phase 4 consequences. A Crusader army, supposedly heading to fight Muslims in Egypt, was manipulated by Venetian merchants and Byzantine political factions. They attacked and sacked Constantinople itself, the greatest Christian city in the world. For 3 days, Crusaders looted churches, palaces, and homes. Priceless manuscripts were destroyed. Ancient artworks were melted down for metal. The city that had stood unconquered for 9 centuries fell not to Muslims, but to fellow Christians, motivated partly by debt and economic desperation. The empire fragmented. Latin crusaders established their own empire in Constantinople. Byzantine remnants survived in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. The social fragmentation was complete. Even after Byzantines recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the empire never recovered. Territory had shrunk to a fraction of its former extent. The military was overstretched, trying to defend what remained. Civil wars between rival claimants consumed resources. Wealth inequality had reached extremes, with a few aristocratic families controlling vast estates while the urban population struggled. Infrastructure decay was visible everywhere. The massive walls of Constantinople, which had protected the city for centuries, needed repairs the government couldn't afford. The navy, once dominant in the Mediterranean, had been essentially handed over to Genoan and Venetian merchants in exchange for loans. The empire was militarily overextended, socially fragmented, and financially bankrupt. Phase 5 came in 1453 when Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II besieged Constantinople with a massive army and new cannon technology that could breach the ancient walls. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine V died fighting in the final battle. The city fell on May 29, 1453, ending the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire. But the real ending had come decades earlier, when the economic system collapsed. By 1453, Constantinople's population had shrunk from over 400,000 at its peak to fewer than 50,000. The empire controlled only the city itself and a few surrounding territories. The currency was worthless. The military consisted of a few thousand defenders against an Ottoman army of over 80,000. The Ottomans didn't conquer a thriving empire. They occupied an economic corpse that had been dead for decades. Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, bringing Greek manuscripts that helped spark the Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire became the new dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The pattern had completed once again. Currency debasement, economic collapse, social fragmentation, military defeat, transition to new empire. Britain offers the most recent and best documented example of the 5-phase pattern. The British Empire lasted from roughly 1600 to 1945, and because it occurred in the modern era with extensive records, we can track the pattern with precision. Phase 1 ran from approximately 1600 to 1815. England, later Britain, after the 1707 union with Scotland, built an empire through naval dominance and commercial innovation. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 opened the seas, The East India Company, founded in 1600, established trade dominance in Asia. Britain colonized North America, Caribbean islands, and trading posts across Africa and Asia. The Industrial Revolution beginning in the mid-1700s gave Britain technological superiority in manufacturing, particularly textiles and iron production. Steam engines, mechanized production, and coal power created wealth at unprecedented scales. The pound sterling, backed by gold since 1717 under the classical gold standard, became internationally trusted. Britain's banking system, centered in London, financed global trade. The Royal Navy enforced British commercial interests and protected trade routes. By 1815, after defeating Napoleon at Waterloo, Britain emerged as the world's dominant power with no serious rivals. Phase 2 lasted from 1815 to approximately 1914, the Victorian era and Edwardian period. At its peak in 1922, technically after Phase 2 ended but representing the maximum territorial extent, the British Empire governed 458 million people, 1/4 of the world's population. It controlled roughly 1/4 of Earth's land surface across every continent except Antarctica. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was literally true, because British territories spanned every time zone. The pound sterling was the world's primary reserve currency. Over 60% of international trade was invoiced in pounds. The City of London was the world's financial center. British goods, from textiles to steel to locomotives, dominated global markets. British culture, language, and legal systems spread worldwide. The Victorian British believed their empire was permanent, ordained by Providence, the pinnacle of civilization. This wasn't mere propaganda, most genuinely believed it. The British pound seemed as eternal as the gold that backed it. Phase 3 began with World War I and accelerated through World War II. In 1914, Britain's national debt was approximately £650 million. By 1919, it had exploded to over $7 billion. That's more than a 10-fold increase in 5 years. Britain borrowed from everyone, from British citizens through war bonds, from the United States, from any nation or bank that would lend. The war also forced Britain off the gold standard. In 1914, when war broke out, the government suspended gold convertibility. They had to print money to fund the war effort, and they couldn't maintain gold backing while doing it. The pound became a fiat currency, backed by nothing but the government's promise. After the war, Britain desperately tried to return to normalcy. In 1925, Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill made a catastrophic decision. He returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. The pound was now overvalued relative to Britain's actual economic strength. British exports became uncompetitive. Unemployment soared above 10%. The government had to maintain high interest rates to defend the currency, which crushed economic growth and investment. The coal industry collapsed, leading to the general strike of 1926. By 1931, Britain was forced off gold again, permanently this time. The pound was devalued by 25% almost immediately. Trust in British currency began eroding among international holders. But the real destruction came with World War II. Britain entered the war already weakened by the Depression and the economic struggles of the 1930s. The war cost everything. By 1945, Britain's national debt had reached 270% of GDP, the highest level in British history. Entire cities lay in ruins from German bombing. The industrial base was converted entirely to war production. Britain owed massive debts to the United States, which demanded repayment. The 1944 Bretton Woods Conference redesigned the global financial system, and Britain fought desperately to preserve the pound's role as a reserve currency. They lost. The United States, creditor to the world and holder of most of the world's gold reserves, dictated terms. The US dollar, not the pound, would be the primary reserve currency. The pound would be a secondary reserve at best. For Britain, this was the end of financial empire, even though political empire still existed on maps. What followed was a painful, humiliating decline. In 1947, Britain tried to make the pound freely convertible again, betting on the currency's strength. The experiment lasted 6 weeks before a run on the pound forced re-imposition of capital controls. In 1949, the pound was devalued by 30% against the dollar. British savings were wiped out. In 1967, facing another currency crisis, the pound was devalued again by 14%. Each devaluation signaled to the world that Britain was no longer a first-rate economic power. Phase 4 unfolded rapidly between 1945 and 1980. The empire disintegrated at stunning speed. India, the crown jewel of the empire, gained independence in 1947. Burma and Ceylon followed in 1948. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, African and Caribbean colonies gained independence in rapid succession. By 1968, Britain had withdrawn military forces from east of Suez, meaning it could no longer project power in Asia. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated British weakness definitively. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France invaded to retake it. The United States opposed the action and threatened to collapse the pound if Britain didn't withdraw. Britain withdrew. The humiliation was complete. The empire that had once ruled a quarter of the globe couldn't conduct a military operation without American permission. Domestically, Britain faced social fragmentation and economic chaos. The 1970s were catastrophic. Inflation hit 25% in 1975. The government imposed a 3-day workweek in 1974 to conserve electricity. Strikes paralyzed industry. The pound collapsed in value. Unemployment soared. In 1976, Britain was forced to request an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, a humiliating admission that the country that had once financed the world was now bankrupt. The IMF demanded spending cuts and economic reforms as conditions. The British disease became shorthand for industrial decline, labor unrest, and economic stagnation. The infrastructure that Britain had built in the Victorian era was crumbling. Roads, rail, ports, all deteriorating from underinvestment. The military, which had once controlled the seas, was a shadow of its former self. Britain had all the characteristics of Phase 4: currency collapse, social fragmentation, infrastructure decay, loss of international power. Phase 5 for Britain wasn't a dramatic collapse like Rome or Byzantium. Instead, it was a transition to middle power status. The Thatcher government in the 1980s implemented painful reforms that stabilized the economy but couldn't restore empire. Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, accepting a regional role rather than a global one. The pound remained a currency but not the currency. London maintained importance as a financial center, but New York had superseded it. British culture, particularly language and entertainment, continued influencing the world, but political and military power had transferred to the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War. Britain adapted to being a respected but secondary power, a former empire learning to exist in a world it no longer dominated. Phase 5 was a managed decline rather than catastrophic collapse, but the empire was gone regardless. Which brings us to the present moment. The United States is currently the dominant global empire. The question isn't whether America is an empire. It obviously is by any historical definition. Global military presence, reserve currency, international trade dominance, cultural hegemony. The question is which phase the United States currently occupies in the 5-phase pattern. Phase 1 for America lasted from approximately 1945 to 1970. World War II ended with the United States holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, an intact industrial base while Europe and Asia lay in ruins, and unmatched military power including a nuclear monopoly. The Bretton Woods system in 1944 established the dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Other nations pegged their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was as good as gold, literally exchangeable at a fixed rate. American innovation dominated. Nuclear technology, jet aircraft, computers, television, pharmaceuticals. The interstate highway system, built in the 1950s, created infrastructure rivaling Roman roads. American universities attracted the world's best talent. The dollar was universally trusted and desired. This was American Phase 1, the foundation of empire. Phase 2 ran from approximately 1970 to 2000. Despite the Vietnam War's failure and various economic challenges, this period saw American dominance reach its peak in many measures. The Cold War ended in 1991 with Soviet collapse, leaving America as the sole superpower. The unipolar moment generated immense confidence. Francis Fukuyama wrote, "The end of history arguing that liberal democracy had permanently triumphed. The tech boom of the 1990s created massive wealth. American culture dominated globally through Hollywood, music, television, and later the internet. The dollar's role as reserve currency seemed permanent and natural. Trade globalization enriched American consumers with cheap goods, while American companies went multinational. The military, though challenged in Vietnam, was restructured and dominated the 1991 Gulf War so completely that American military supremacy seemed unchallengeable. This was peak American confidence, peak American power, the belief that the system was permanent. Phase 3 began around 2000 and is ongoing. This is where the pattern becomes uncomfortable, because we're living through it. The warning signs are unmistakable to anyone familiar with the historical pattern. Let's start with currency debasement. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window, ending dollar convertibility to gold. Foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, had noticed America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. They started demanding gold in exchange for dollars. The gold was leaving Fort Knox. Nixon ended convertibility rather than admit the dollar was overextended. The dollar became a pure fiat currency backed by nothing except trust in the US government, exactly like the Roman denarius after debasement, exactly like the pound after 1931. At first, the petrodollar system established in the 1970s created artificial demand for dollars. Saudi Arabia and other oil producers agreed to price oil exclusively in dollars in exchange for US military protection. Every nation needing oil needed dollars, creating global demand. But the spending never stopped, and the debt grew exponentially. In 1980, US national debt was $900 billion, already high but manageable at roughly 30% of GDP. By 2000, it reached $5.6 trillion. By 2008, it was $10 trillion. By 2020, $27 trillion. Today, in 2025, it exceeds $36 trillion. That's a 40-fold increase in 45 years. And the acceleration is increasing. The United States now adds $1 trillion in debt approximately every 100 days. To put this in perspective, it took 200 years for America to accumulate its first trillion in debt. Now it adds that much in 3 months. But the debt is only part of the currency debasement story. Like Rome reducing silver in the denarius, like Byzantium reducing gold in the solidus, America is debasing through money printing. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars from nothing through quantitative easing. During the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed's balance sheet was under $1 trillion. By 2015, it had grown to $4.5 trillion. During COVID-19, it exploded to over $9 trillion. That's money created electronically. No gold backing, no real assets, just digital entries that dilute every existing dollar. The government and economists insist this won't cause inflation, that modern monetary theory has solved the old problems, that we're different. We're not different. Inflation hit 9% officially in 2022, the highest in 40 years. Real inflation, measured by what ordinary people actually pay for food, housing, healthcare, and education, is far higher. A house that cost $150,000 in 2000 costs $400,000 today. A college education that cost $20,000 annually now costs $60,000. Healthcare costs have tripled. The dollar is being debased, slowly at first, but the historical pattern shows it always accelerates. And like Britain losing reserve currency status at Bretton Woods, America is watching dollar dominance erode in real time. In 2000, over 70% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in dollars. Today, it's approximately 58% and falling. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus new members like Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and UAE, are actively building alternatives to dollar dominance. They're conducting trade in local currencies, establishing currency swap agreements that bypass the dollar, and creating new payment systems to avoid SWIFT, the Western-dominated financial messaging system. China and Russia have been buying gold aggressively for years, diversifying their reserves away from dollars. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system, is now accepting yuan for oil sales to China and discussing pricing in other currencies. These aren't hypothetical future developments. They're happening now. The pattern of Phase 3 is clear. Deficit spending, currency debasement through printing, inflation, and declining reserve currency status. America is deep into Phase 3, and the indicators suggest transition into Phase 4 is underway. Phase 4 is defined by social fragmentation and military overextension, and the United States shows clear symptoms of both. Let's examine military overextension first because the parallels to Rome are striking. The United States maintains approximately 750 military bases in over 80 countries. For comparison, Britain at the peak of its empire maintained about 50 major bases globally, and that was considered massive overextension. American military commitments span the globe. NATO obligations in Europe, security guarantees to Japan and South Korea, presence in the Middle East, growing commitments in the Pacific to counter China, presence in Africa and Latin America. The defense budget exceeds $850 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. But the costs go beyond the official budget. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost over $8 trillion when accounting for veteran care, debt interest, and ongoing commitments. That's more than the entire US GDP in 1990. The military is simultaneously asked to deter Russia in Europe, prevent Iranian regional dominance, maintain stability in the Middle East, counter China in the Pacific, fight terrorist groups in multiple countries, secure global shipping lanes, and maintain readiness for theoretical conflicts with peer adversaries. This is the definition of overextension. Like Roman legions stretched across 4,000 miles of frontier, like Byzantine armies fighting on multiple fronts, like Britain trying to maintain empire while fighting world wars, the American military is being asked to do more than resources sustainably allow, and increasingly recruitment is falling short. The military cannot meet enlistment goals, suggesting that American citizens are less willing to serve in an overstretched military fighting unclear objectives in distant lands. The social fragmentation is equally clear. Wealth inequality in America has reached levels not seen since the 1920s. The Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, shows America is now more unequal than any other developed nation and approaching levels typically seen in developing countries. The top 1% of Americans hold more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. This mirrors the late Roman pattern, where a small senatorial class owned vast estates while the middle class disappeared. The American middle class, as a percentage of the population, has been shrinking for decades. Home ownership rates for young people have collapsed. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, have been stagnant since the 1970s for most workers, while costs for housing, education, and healthcare have exploded. Geographic fragmentation is also increasing. Coastal urban areas and interior rural areas might as well be different countries in terms of economy, culture, and political views. Political polarization has reached levels not seen since the Civil War era, according to multiple metrics. Congress is less productive, passing fewer bills, with more partisan voting patterns. Trust in institutions has collapsed. Gallup polling shows trust in Congress at historic lows around 10–15%. Trust in media, courts, and other institutions has similarly declined. Americans increasingly consume different news, live in different cultural worlds, and view opposing political parties not as opponents, but as existential threats. This is social fragmentation. State governments increasingly ignore or resist federal directives. The social cohesion that holds empires together during stress is visibly fraying. Infrastructure decay is advanced. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives U.S. infrastructure a C grade. Roads, bridges, water systems, electrical grids, ports, airports, all are deteriorating from decades of underinvestment. The Biden administration's infrastructure bill, while significant, addresses only a fraction of the estimated $2.6 trillion maintenance backlog. Why can't the richest country in history maintain its infrastructure? Because the money is going to debt service, entitlements, and military commitments. Infrastructure maintenance is being deferred, exactly like late Roman Empire, exactly like Britain in the 1970s. The physical foundation of the empire is crumbling. All of these indicators, military overextension, wealth inequality, social fragmentation, infrastructure decay, define Phase 4. The question isn't whether America shows Phase 4 characteristics. The question is how far into Phase 4 we are and how quickly Phase 5 approaches. Phase 5 in the historical pattern means collapse and transition. But collapse comes in different forms depending on circumstances. Rome experienced chaotic fragmentation. The Western Empire broke apart into competing kingdoms. The currency became worthless. Trade collapsed. Urban civilization contracted. Population declined. It took centuries for Europe to recover economically. This is the worst-case scenario. Systemic breakdown. Not just economic, but social and political. Byzantium faced military conquest after centuries of decline. The Ottoman Empire replaced Byzantine power in the Eastern Mediterranean, but Byzantine scholars, fleeing to Italy, helped spark the Renaissance. Byzantine legal traditions influenced Ottoman administration. The transition, while catastrophic for Byzantines, led to cultural transmission and the rise of a new empire. Britain experienced managed decline. The empire dissolved rapidly but didn't disappear. Britain transitioned to being a respected middle power with nuclear weapons, UN Security Council membership, and significant but not dominant economic power. The transition was humiliating and economically painful, but Britain remains a stable, democratic, wealthy nation by global standards. This represents the best-case Phase 5 outcome: loss of empire status without total collapse. For the United States, all three possibilities exist. Chaotic collapse remains possible if the dollar loses reserve status suddenly, if debt becomes unsustainable, if social fragmentation leads to genuine constitutional crisis. Military defeat to a peer competitor like China could trigger rapid decline. Economic collapse worse than the Great Depression could fragment the Union. These are low probability but non-zero scenarios. More likely is something resembling British decline, a gradual loss of global dominance, currency devaluation, economic stagnation, but not total collapse. The yuan or a basket of currencies might replace the dollar as primary reserve. American military presence would contract from 750 bases to perhaps 100. Defense spending would decline to European levels around 2 to 3% of GDP. Living standards would adjust downward, but catastrophe would be avoided. America would become one major power among several, rather than the dominant superpower. The wildcard is whether Phase 4 can be reversed or at least slowed. Britain's Phase 4 lasted about 35 years from 1945 to 1980, before stabilizing in Phase 5. Rome's Phase 4 lasted over a century before collapse. The timing depends on decisions made during Phase 4. Fiscal responsibility could slow the pattern. Reducing military commitments could relieve pressure. Infrastructure investment could rebuild physical capital. Social reforms could reduce fragmentation. But history suggests these reforms are unlikely during Phase 4 because the political incentives favor short-term solutions. Democracy tends toward spending increases and tax cuts, not painful austerity. Interest groups resist reforms that affect them. The public resists acknowledging decline. Every empire in Phase 4 has believed it could maintain its position through willpower alone. None succeeded. This analysis represents my interpretation of historical patterns applied to current conditions. I am not a financial advisor, and nothing here should be construed as financial advice. I'm not predicting specific timelines or guaranteed outcomes. History provides patterns, not prophecies. The Roman pattern took centuries. Britain's took decades. America's timeline is unknown. I'm not arguing for defeatism or suggesting America will definitely collapse. I'm arguing that America is following a well-documented historical pattern, that we're currently in Phase 4 based on measurable indicators, and that Phase 5 historically means significant contraction of empire. Whether that manifests as chaotic collapse, military defeat, or managed decline to middle power status depends on decisions made in the coming years and decades. What individuals should do with this information is personal. Some might diversify investments internationally. Others might develop skills useful in various economic scenarios. Some might focus on community resilience. Others might work politically to change the trajectory. The point of understanding the pattern isn't fatalism, it's preparation. Families who understood they were in late-stage Rome made different decisions than those in denial. British families who recognized their empire was ending in the 1950s positioned themselves differently. than those expecting Victorian restoration. The pattern doesn't guarantee specific outcomes, but it does suggest probabilities. 4 empires have followed this pattern. None reversed course once deep into Phase 4. The economic fundamentals, debt, currency debasement, overextension, don't care about national identity or exceptionalism. The math is absolute. You cannot print prosperity. You cannot borrow forever. You cannot maintain empire when your currency is debasing and your society is fragmenting. Rome took 2 centuries to move through all 5 phases. Byzantium took 4 centuries. Britain took 1 century. The modern pace of change suggests America's pattern may be faster than Britain's. We entered Phase 3 around 2000. We appear to be entering Phase 4 now in 2025. If the pattern holds and accelerates, Phase 5 could begin within 10 to 30 years. That's not prophecy, it's pattern recognition. But pattern recognition based on historical precedent is the best tool we have for understanding where we are and what comes next. The pattern has repeated 4 times across 2 millennia. The 5th repetition is underway. For more interesting insights into our world and economy, check this out.